Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be doing a hybrid of things. On one hand, we're going to be doing a non-spoiler review for Isles of the Emberdark, which for the rest of this video I will just refer to as Emberdark, and then from there we'll transition into talking about not only thoughts for the potential future of the Cosmere, but somewhat of a retrospective actually for pieces of the Cosmere that I started to gather after having read Emberdark. If you don't actually want to see the non-spoiler review portion of Emberdark, either because you've already read it or because you don't want to know too much about it before getting into it, I'll have a timestamp so you can just jump to the other part of it, because within the other section, I also do want to invite all of you to provide your thoughts on some of the talking points, and I'm very eager to see if anybody also has some similar feelings to me, but also what your feelings about these sorts of things are in general, regardless of whether they're similar. All that stated though, let's go ahead and kick things off with the review for Emberdark. First and foremost, I want to say that I think this book, I wouldn't conclusively state that it is young adult, but I do think that this book could very easily be read by a 12-year-old. And the reason I want to say I don't think conclusively it's not exactly young adult is because a core part of a young adult story is to have experiences that represent what young people are going through. If you look at the origin of the young adult age range, that is where it got started. It was a recognition that it is important for young people to have works that illuminate what they're experiencing and what they're going through. That said, even though I think the tone of Emberdark is easily accessible to younger people, and I think there are a lot of younger people that will really enjoy this, I also don't necessarily think that the thematic elements are specific to that. I don't think they're necessarily showcasing young people's experiences. In fact, the protagonist of the story, Six of the Dusk, is somebody who is more so a middle-aged man who is kind of trying to figure out his purpose in life after what he previously dedicated his life to seems no longer needed. It's essentially obsolete. And the reason that it is now obsolete is because of advancements in technology. He is somebody who had a lot of knowledge when it came to the environment, the specific very, very deadly place that he lived within. He was used to living a life of isolation, and people like him were important because they understood this group of islands so well. But with the advancements of technology, people are now able to traverse these places without necessarily needing somebody like him. However, now we are seeing that with how much things are progressing, there are other individuals, and this is where the kind of science fiction angle comes into the picture, beyond just the fantasy elements, but we do see there are other individuals that are very interested in the resources that are available on these islands. And so now not only does he feel obsolete, but he feels like he is unnecessary and redundant because he cannot provide anything in order to try and keep away stronger powers from conquering them. So you have one thematic element that has to do with this identity crisis almost, and feeling like the world has passed you by, which I think definitely is something that people that are outside of the young adult age range are more likely to connect with. Not only do you have that going on, you also have a lot of commentary on the conquering of other people, and specifically for the sake of resources, of land, of being able to then have power over other individuals. And it's almost like an arms race to some degree, because as soon as one powerful entity wants to take over, another one sees that, and then they also are interested. And you kind of see this horrible place that people are put in when they have to decide, do we just give over without a fight, or do we ask other people to fight against people that are more powerful than us, more technologically advanced than us, and potentially lead to bloodshed that ultimately feels like, what's the point, because they'll probably win anyway, and then we're just leading a bunch of people to their deaths. So there's a lot of modernity versus the past and nature, also all this kind of coinciding. And the way that the story ends up taking off is that it's a split timeline between our main character when he was younger and when he was first being introduced to things that are more advanced from where he is currently, to him now in present day doing everything he can to try and navigate this certain area that will allow them access outside of their own planet. And if they are able to get access outside of their own planet, that gives them a little bit of an edge against the people that want to take them over. Because at the end of the day, what they're fighting for is their independence. All of those thematic pieces I really enjoyed, and I felt like they all were done in a way that felt true to the characters, that were integrated into the world building quite well. These thematic pieces were repeated quite often in a way that perhaps in young adults I would understand the repetition of certain themes. In an adult fantasy work or adult sci-fantasy work, I do expect there to be a little bit of backing off and knowing that the reader and trusting that the reader is going to pick up on these things. We did feel the need to state these thematic elements over and over and over again, and I don't have a problem, and I want to be really clear about this, I don't have a problem whatsoever with overt themes. I don't, though, always love when the themes are overt and you continuously tell me over and over again what the themes are, because by the very nature of them being overt, I know what they are. And again, I feel like this is different in, I would say especially the younger end of young adult, because of course the young adult age range in America is 12 to 18. I believe in certain other countries there's almost like two different sections of young adult. I would actually say this felt like on the younger end of that section. So it was kind of odd to have these important big themes, but then also told to you in a way where it felt like perhaps maybe a little more trust could be given to the reader to pick up on them. I also think it didn't help that sometimes the dialogue between the characters felt a little bit more on the youthful side. It didn't necessarily feel like I was listening to two 40-plus-year-olds talking to each other, and it just in general kind of had a feel of almost like a Marvel movie where sometimes there's silly little quips and something really dangerous would happen, but there's this general air of like camaraderie, we can do it, guys. And I think that this especially was true of another perspective that comes into the picture, where this individual is trying so hard to hype up their crew, to keep people motivated, and to make them feel like they are capable of everything that goes beyond what they actually think they can do. And the way this character talks and tries to hype everybody up, it also felt a little bit young. So I don't have a problem with any of it feeling young. I just want to make that as clear as possible, because I think in the past, when picking up a Cosmere work, which this is, Cosmere works were known to be adult fantasy. Certainly accessible, I think, to a lot of people that were young adult readers within that age range. They were accessible to them, but it was more formally adult fantasy, whereas I think Emberdark, as well as some of the other secret projects, I think a lot of them have leaned more into the youthful side. You could see a lot of the secret projects as entry points into the Cosmere, which makes sense because the more that the Cosmere expands, the more that you're going to have these points that feel different, especially because they're taking place in what are essentially like different time periods. Some of them feel a little bit like classic fantasy. For example, Elantris feels a little bit closer to classic fantasy. Then you have some that feel more like epic sci-fantasy, like the Stormlight Archive, or ones like Mistborn that are high dark fantasy. So you have these different tones within them, as well as feeling like almost different time periods. And the more modern it becomes, I would say the more modern it's becoming, the more youthful it's sounding. And I don't know if this is an intention with this specific story where Sanderson wanted it to feel like this, or if this is just maybe the direction the Cosmere is going, like Sanderson's writing, when he's writing more modern, just naturally ends up feeling more youthful. I'm not exactly sure, but regardless, that is the general tone of this one. There's also, I would say, repetition in the characterization. So for example, we see with somebody like Six of the Dusk, our protagonist, that he is not someone who typically is accustomed to communicating with other people. He's lived a lot of his life in isolation. So a phrase that will get used, or a version of this phrase that gets stated quite often in the narrative that he kind of says to himself, when somebody's talking and clearly they are asking a question in the way that they are stating whatever it is that they're saying to you, it's clear they're kind of asking a question, but they're not directly literally saying like, what do you think? It'll be like, I bet you have a lot to say about that. They'll say something like that, and it's kind of like they're waiting for you to say something. And then Dusk will think it wasn't a question, so he felt no need to respond. And it says that, or a version of that, many, many times. I would say how the characterization and the thematic elements tie together, that additionally has a lot of repetition. So for example, not only do you have that of, oh, they didn't ask a direct question, so I feel no need to answer. Not only do you have that quite frequently, but he will also notice the way that words adapt and change over time. And then he'll comment like, words are interesting. Words are always changing. Words are fascinating. Words change, like people change. The world is changing. It's kind of that sort of narrative pretty often when you're with his perspective. And I appreciate, especially in third person points of view, I do appreciate when you utilize the narrative to distinguish voices. It allows for us to feel closer to the characters, to understand the characters. You'll see, I think one example I always come to is that a Kaladin chapter in Stormlight Archive feels very different from a Lift chapter in Stormlight Archive. So that's an example of kind of this close third-person perspective. However, I once again come back to this idea that I think you can allow for your readers to pick up on subtlety. I don't mind the occasional reminding readers of certain characteristics of characters or turns of phrase or something like that, but I think there are ways to, at some point, you can tell us. I'm not one of these individuals that will consistently use show don't tell over and over again as a criticism, because sometimes just telling readers, that's all you got. Sometimes you just tell them. I don't think that's always a bad thing. However, I think after you've told us, from then on out, it's okay to mostly just show us. So for example, if you have a part of the story where somebody doesn't directly ask a question, but there's an implied question, instead of having Dusk in the narrative think it wasn't a direct question, so I don't have to answer, rather than having something like that, you can just have him not respond. And at some point we will see that, oh, look, just like what it said at the beginning, he never feels the need to reply. He stays quiet. You can even then give us something that he is doing instead of responding. You can show us the way that he starts to just do something else, or he walks off, or something like that. I'm just throwing out examples, but you don't have to tell us over and over again. Telling a little is okay, but when it starts to get excessive, I think that's not only what lends itself to feeling younger, but then it starts to feel like one of two things. Like maybe we could have cut some of those because maybe the repetition just we didn't catch it a little bit when we were going through and editing, or it really feels like maybe the readers, you don't think we're going to pick up on this, and you feel like we need to be told many times, and I don't think we do. I think we got it. One thing though that I do want to compliment, and that this is a consistent compliment over the course of many of Sanderson's works, is the creativity is, as usual, off the charts. There's just so much thought and care put into the worlds, and also not just individual pieces of the worlds. Everything really fits together, so if you have a certain environment that is very dangerous, it makes sense then that you will elaborate on what makes it dangerous and the specifics behind it. You're not just telling us, oh, it's really dangerous out here, there's enemies. But you do have various ways that all of the way the ecosystem functions, and he, I think, really thinks quite a lot about that. I think we're so accustomed to seeing Sanderson thinking so much about his magic systems and how the magic is incorporated into said ecosystems. Whereas in this, I feel like the ecosystem came first, and there were times that I sat back and I'm like, oh, that's really cool, that's really creative, or that feels like a piece of something really fascinating about our own world, but you've taken it and you've heightened it and you've made it your own. Overall, as far as my personal feelings for Emberdark, I think it's probably pretty clear that I thought that this one would have benefited from maybe a little bit of trimming and allowing for subtlety to speak for itself on occasion, because I liked a lot of the themes, I liked the world, but I do think that it wasn't the strongest of Sanderson's works for me personally. But I do want to now segue into how I feel like this story sort of informs my retrospective take on some things, but then also where things might be going from here. As stated at the beginning, I really invite all of you to provide your input about this specific portion. Of course, you can let me know your thoughts on Emberdark also, but I feel like a lot of what I'm about to say here, there are going to be so many different views on this, and I am really eager to see all these different other perspectives that maybe I haven't thought of, or that I wouldn't have ever even considered. So I wanted to start with what I'm calling my retrospective on the Cosmere a little bit. I know not everybody feels the same, but for myself, I personally thought that there was a tone shift in Wind and Truth. And I had read through a lot of the Cosmere leading up to the release of Wind and Truth. I did read-alongs, and we had in-depth spoiler discussions for a lot of the books leading up to the release of Wind and Truth, because it was such a big release for so many of us that are not only fans of Sanderson, but fans of fantasy overall. And for me, Wind and Truth ended up being one of my least favorites. And I would say of the Stormlight Archive books themselves, it was a least favorite for me. And I wasn't the only one that felt this shift. Like I said, I know not everybody felt it, but some of my friends felt it. I saw some other people who were also really excited about the release, feeling like it seemed different than some of the previous works. And a friend that I met up with recently, they were like, we gotta talk books, and they really want to talk about it. And they're like, I just felt like it felt so different. And so even people that aren't necessarily as in bookish circles, it would seem even they kind of were feeling something. It's not like, oh, I heard other people say this, so I agree. It was that some people just had that feeling. And then it was interesting to get to talk to people who were outside of bookish spaces, because sometimes we get in these bubbles and we kind of collectively have a viewpoint, and suddenly the bubble will burst when you talk to somebody outside of that viewpoint and you realize like, oh wow, people have very different takes. So it was kind of interesting to see somebody outside of that have that feeling as well. But after reading Emberdark, I thought about the fact that between Rhythm of War and Wind and Truth, a lot of Sanderson's writing was dedicated to the secret projects. So at this point we had 5, technically, if you also think about Emberdark. Because if I'm not mistaken, I think a lot of Emberdark was written around the time of the other secret projects, but because of the having to incorporate the novella short story aspects to it, it took longer to come out. But I think it had been written in the past. So you have Tress the Emerald Sea, which does feel a little on the younger side. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, which the main characters are younger. So that one I feel like it especially makes sense for it to feel on the younger side. And it's very wholesome, and it's a fun story, but it felt younger. And then Frugal Wizard's Guide to Surviving Medieval England. It's such a mouthful of a title. That one is not Cosmere, and that one felt... I mean, it's funny, because on one hand, people are like, this feels like middle grade, and then other people are like, this feels like, dad jokes. It's like, yeah, I think both those things are true. So it kind of has its tone all on its own. So you had that one, but I wouldn't say by any means it feels darker or grittier, or it feels like very mature and sophisticated. I wouldn't say that about Frugal Wizard. So you have Tress, Yumi, Frugal Wizard, and then Sunlit Man did have, in my opinion, a little bit more of a Mistborn Era 2 feel. And then we have this one, which, as I stated pretty frequently over the course of the review, feels on the younger side. So that's 5. And then we had to complete the Skyward series, which is young adult. It is formally considered young adult. I think there's the intention to write it with a young adult lens. So that one is young adult. So you have so many works that were written between Rhythm of War and Wind and Truth. And it's possible that in writing all of these, because I remember when Wind and Truth came out, it almost came across like because Sanderson's very communicative with his fans, and when it came out, I think there was a little bit like, I think I wrote this like how I write a lot of my works, and it's like a lot of works maybe recently. Maybe that's part of why it felt different, because I think in the past, different sections of the Cosmere overall felt different. So Mistborn Era 1 feels very different from Mistborn Era 2. And Stormlight Archive felt different from Elantris. Like, you had these different, almost like you could say, pockets, and they had different tones to them. I kind of touched on this in talking about Emberdark as well. So you had different ones, but it almost felt like within a contained world or story, it had its own established tone. And so it was fine if certain stories were going to have their own established tones. If you think, oh, this one's not as much for me, I'll admit I don't like the tone of Mistborn Era 2 as much as Era 1. So just kind of using that as an example. But there's also an understanding of, well, but there's so much that's being offered across the Cosmere that it's okay if this one isn't exactly for me. It's definitely going to work for other people, and that's great. I appreciate that we have so many different options as well, because that's a skill in and of itself, to not feel the same over and over and over again from one book by an author to another. To be able to write stories that are not only creatively different from each other, but are able to tap into something that feels different in general, I think that's quite a feat. However, I think that when we came back to Wind and Truth, after being away from it for a while and we wrote that again, it felt like maybe it was more in the space of all of these more youthful feeling stories. And it wasn't necessarily because it'd been a long time since writing Rhythm of War. Well, I should say, it wasn't technically a long time. It is just a lot of books in between. That's a better way to put it, because he doesn't really take a long time to write much of anything. But, and that sounded like an insult. I mean, like, it's impressive that he writes the amount of books that he writes. I don't know why it sounded so 5e when I said it. But anyway, not that much time, just a lot of books between Rhythm of War and Wind and Truth. So I think maybe we were still in that. So that's my kind of retrospective thoughts of when I look back and think like, well, why did so much change? Especially because he's such a plotter, so much of this had been in his mind, but why did the writing feel different? And I think maybe that's part of it. But then now thinking about, instead of a retrospective, now looking ahead, my hope moving forward is that we do return to various individual series can have their own voices. I recognize that the bigger the Cosmere gets and the more connected it gets, that the blending of those voices sometimes might have to happen. It's kind of like how, I mean, this is a silly example, but back when we had the Netflix Marvel shows, you had like Daredevil and Jessica Jones. And then when they came together for that one with Iron Fist, which by the way, Iron Fist, oh my gosh, was that bad. But when they came together, I think they're called the Defenders instead of the Avengers. I think they were called the Defenders. And you're like, this is actually kind of weird because Iron Fist's tone and Jessica Jones, they don't exactly mesh, it feels like. So I recognize that sometimes if you're going to have things mesh, that those stories, they even might start to have their own tone. But I'm hopeful with this third era of Mistborn that we're going to get. I'm hopeful, especially because if I understand correctly, his plans are to write it, turn it into Tor, they will publish it, and then it'll be kind of... They will really make sure that the editing is cohesive across the series, which I believe he's stated was kind of what they did for Mistborn Era 1. And I think you can feel it in Mistborn Era 1. So I'm really hopeful that... I'm not saying I want the tone to be specifically to my tastes. I'm just hopeful that whatever tone serves that story, that it is consistent throughout that series, and that it is its own voice, as opposed to this voice that I think has started to seep into pretty much every aspect of his writing, whether it feels similar to the worlds they were existing within before or not. So that's my hope moving forward. And I'm very curious to know, do you think... No, I think this is just his authorial voice all the time now. Do you think he is going to try to go back to having a different voice for different worlds, different planets, different magic systems, however you want to think of it? Do you think he's going to go more that route? What are your thoughts on perhaps whether Wind and Truth felt different to other Stormlight books or not? So just in general, I would love to see your viewpoints on all of this. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.